Thanks for the intro, Ben. Welcome, everybody. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the keynote for our first ever Future of DevOps Summit. I'm Kevin, Gearset CEO. And today I'm going to be exploring the results of our State of Salesforce DevOps survey. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And as we've grown Gearset over the last 4 years, we've seen an explosion in interest in all things DevOps. So let's dive straight in. We launched the State of Salesforce DevOps survey in January this year, and the response has been overwhelming. We've had Salesforce professionals around the world and from across the ecosystem take the time to give us detailed answers on their team, their process, and plans. This is now the largest industry survey on DevOps for Salesforce, and the goal of the survey was to bring to light the latest insights into the current state of Salesforce DevOps and how we can expect that landscape to continue to evolve over the coming months and years. We used the survey findings to put together this keynote, where I'll call out some of the trends and observations, but we've also compiled a full report to share these insights back with you. One of the practical things I'm hoping you can take from today's session as we go through is to assess how your team compares to these findings. Where are you in your DevOps journey relative to your peers? What maturity level are you at in terms of DevOps? And what next steps should you be taking to unlock more of the potential of Salesforce DevOps? Kicking off then, so let's look at some survey demographics. Who actually took part? In total, over 500 people completed the survey, and I'd like to start with a massive thank you to everyone who took part. First, looking at where folks were based, as expected, survey respondents were mainly in the US, Canada, and Europe. However, it was great to see global participation and responses from across the world. It'll be interesting to see how this picture develops in coming years as Salesforce grows its markets internationally. With more and more teams working across borders and time zones, DevOps becomes a critical component in effective collaboration. If we look at it broken down by industry verticals, you can see that pretty much every industry has replied, with most folks working in tech, finance, and health and life sciences. Obviously, massive verticals for Salesforce. Another really interesting way to interrogate the data is based on the size of the Salesforce instance. So what Salesforce teams are having to manage on behalf of their users. And we got responses from big and small. At the top end, 21% of respondents work in large enterprises and support more than 10,000 Salesforce users. But we also had responses from folks working in startups and smaller teams that look after just that 100 to 1 user segment. I think what's interesting here is that it's a real reflection that Salesforce and Salesforce DevOps has something to offer all companies. Let's talk about adoption. What we're seeing is a widespread move to Salesforce DevOps, which is fantastic. Before starting Gearset, I came from other platforms where source control, CI/CD, and mature DevOps was expected of engineering teams. When we started Gearset, most Salesforce teams that we spoke to at that time hadn't come across DevOps, almost never used source control, and most folks were chipping away with change sets. And what a difference 4 years makes. Salesforce DevOps has entered a new era. It's no longer a pipe dream, and it's a reality for many teams. For those of you yet to start, most teams know that it's a process change that must be undertaken to stay ahead. We're finally seeing that the majority of DevOps teams have adopted tooling and practices in some capacity, and we're entering an exciting new phase in the ecosystem. Let's take a look at the current state of DevOps adoption and what that looks like. Unsurprisingly, respondents consistently stated that source control contributes the most value to their development process, with 7 out of 10 respondents currently using source control. This is a massive change from 4 years ago. Among the remaining teams still at the very start of their DevOps journey, even then, more than half are planning to adopt source control and implement a CI/CD process over the coming 12 months. This is a really important point. We've been talking about it now for the past few years. The Salesforce platform was late to version control, but it really is the core pillar that should underpin your entire DevOps process. So it's great to see that this is a focus for so many teams. If you're just starting your DevOps journey, source control is absolutely where you should begin. Once your team is all bought in and comfortable, that's when you can begin to add automation, move into CI/CD. And by the way, over 3/4 of Gearset users have already adopted source control as their source of truth, compared to only about 60% of non-Gearset respondents. If we take a look at the different aspects of a robust DevOps process and their adoption or planned adoption, it's clear from the survey results that DevOps has reached a really exciting turning point. Among survey respondents, the adoption of Salesforce tools and practices is already quite widespread. Adoption rates of fundamental DevOps tools are high across the board, from teams in small organizations right through to enterprise companies with more than 10,000 employees. Adoption is being driven primarily by increased business demand, but we can dig into that a little bit later. Based on the data, we consistently see that all the key elements of a DevOps process and its associated tools are either being used or will be adopted in the next year. These include making sure you have a comprehensive org backup, reliable testing, automation in the form of CI/CD, and of course, version control. As a result of the increased demand and businesses expanding their Salesforce teams, processes have necessarily become more complex for over half of our respondents. And they reach for a DevOps process to help them manage that complexity. The biggest obstacle to adoption has been ramp-up time to implement DevOps tools, especially if you go down a DIY DevOps route and take care of integrating all of the various software products yourself. Or indeed, if you bring in a waterfall DevOps tool that requires you to jettison even the processes that you might have that are working today, things like user story management, effectively downing tools for a quarter to implement something. This kind of disruption just kills your velocity. The adoption of DevOps and CI/CD in particular has brought its own challenges. Steep learning curves and problems adopting source control are amongst some of the biggest that are hindering DevOps adoption. But for teams that push through these obstacles, once everything is set up, the benefits of automation and the ROI on DevOps is abundantly clear. We'll cover a little more on this later, but for now I want to look at some of the drivers behind DevOps adoption. It's clear that the adoption rate for DevOps is accelerating, and it's becoming a greater priority for teams. It's interesting to look at why teams are adopting DevOps. This chart shows the main challenges that Salesforce teams have faced in 2020, and some of these challenges are the key push factors that are driving teams to adopt DevOps. By far, the most common challenge was increased demand on the team, with over half saying that was their single biggest challenge. The Salesforce platform is bigger today than it has ever been, covering more of the functions and departments at companies than it ever has before. Companies want ever more customization in Salesforce, and teams are feeling the pressure to keep meeting this demand. The bad news is that this is likely only going to increase as Salesforce increasingly becomes the employee app platform. The good news is that this greater demand also means a more streamlined, accurate, and successful release process is more important than ever. Teams are turning to DevOps to help them overcome those challenges. Most companies are looking to better their release processes in order to overcome the increased workload and to get a better ROI from Salesforce. And we've seen from the survey that those improvements come in the form of maturing your DevOps process by adopting source control, CI/CD, and all the rest. The other area that stood out in our results is that companies are going to focus on upskilling their current Salesforce teams more than they are by growing their team. So this could mean internal training on new processes and tooling, working towards more certifications, or team training courses on sites like DevOps Launchpad. If you want to learn more about DevOps, how to get started with source control, and earn badges on the various DevOps disciplines, then DevOps Launchpad is a great free resource to do that, and we'll be sure to include links in the follow-up email. That's some of the ways that teams are being pushed to adopt DevOps. But of course, the other key driver is those pull factors. These are the benefits of DevOps that teams will experience, that once they start to experience, it gets a nice flywheel going, and then they see further and further adoption. It's no surprise really that the increased productivity you get with a mature DevOps process comes in at a high second place given that the increased workload and pressure on the team is the main push factor. But interestingly, in the top spot is the most valued benefit of DevOps is better quality releases. Quality, it turns out, is even more important than quantity. Teams want to get to a place where they're releasing more frequently, absolutely. But more importantly, they're releasing successfully with fewer bugs without having to roll back. Better quality releases obviously tied to productivity, right? I mean, fewer bugs, more time for your team. If we look at delivery velocity, a really interesting aspect of those teams that have already adopted DevOps is that we see a marked positive impact in performance across the board. And with the survey, we broke it down into a few different categories. We started looking at delivery based on frequency of releases, so how often do you deploy, deployment times, how long it takes you to do that release, lead times, how long finished work sits on the shelf before going to production, and change failure rate, how often you need to roll back. Our analysis of this survey data shows a clear positive impact of DevOps tooling. We categorize respondents into elite, high, medium, and low categories based primarily on the frequency of their releases to production. Nearly half of the respondents release to production at least once a week. And on average, most teams release to production at least multiple times each month, if not much more frequently. In fact, only 1 in 10 stated that their teams release to production less than once a month. And once you do something often, you start to get quite good at it. So we see a similar pattern of strong performance across the board when we look at the analysis of average deployment times. More than half of the survey respondents can deploy in less than an hour. So an interesting question for you would be, which half is your team in? There are now just a minority of low-performing teams that are at risk of falling behind. But the good news is that those teams that release less often are catching up with higher-performing teams in terms of their own adoption of DevOps tooling. Only 3% reported that it took their team longer than a day to run a deployment. Unsurprisingly, Gearset users were amongst the highest-performing teams when it came to deployment times. Over 60% reported average deployment times of less than an hour, compared to just 38% of non-Gearset users who reported the same. Once you start releasing often and you've got that process down, then you'll also have a shorter lead time. Lead time is the length of time between when something is built until it gets released into production. In other words, how much inventory have you got sitting on the shelf? 71% reported lead times of a week or less, and Gearset users are twice as likely as non-Gearset users to have lead times of less than 1 day. That's entirely unsurprising to me. It's something we talk about lots during your onboarding with Gearset. It'd be a bit hypocritical of us as a DevOps company if we didn't practice what we preach. And we actually deploy Gearset in production to all of our users globally 3 times each day, at least. This gives us a great insight and personal experience of the hurdles it takes to get your team there and the wins you get when it's in place. Software inventory is a killer. Get the hard work you've completed out to your users, make them happy. It reduces your bug rate, increases your overall delivery velocity. The way I like to think about things is that if deployments are only small, then they can be easily understood. And there's generally only a small amount of risk with it. Only the lowest performers report an average lead time of more than 1 week. As teams adopt DevOps tooling and practices, they're also shipping fewer bugs. There is less in each release, less risk in each release, and the team gets more practiced at it. Most are seeing errors in less than 10% of their releases, and so are saving huge amounts of developer time that would previously have been spent on manual deployment steps, fixing and rolling back issues with production. A reduced change failure rate means you are significantly reducing the cost of your releases by taking away the risk that makes frequent or even daily deployments to production not something you need to be intimidated by. And that's what really it's all about. It's getting that machine well-oiled, well-tuned, making sure your software delivery is high-performing. The other side of DevOps, of course, is around resilience. And DevOps done right makes companies more resilient. It reduces the risks of mistakes because we're carrying less risk in each release. And if a mistake inevitably happens, it makes it easier to recover. There's always the risk of data loss from Salesforce, and lots of companies aren't doing enough when it comes to backup. Whether it's accidental deletion, corruption from an integration job, or indeed a Salesforce outage, every team is at risk of data loss. And for a truly resilient DevOps process, your team must have a secure backup strategy in place. People still don't recognize the risk of data loss. Only 2% identified security as the top challenge for 2021, and I think this is why backup is still lagging behind. So what we're seeing here in these charts is how frequently people back up their orgs and how quickly they expect to be able to restore. Only 61% of teams have data backup right now, but 87% they can say they can restore data within a week. So obviously this can't be true. And what we're looking at is potentially a lot more teams who are not prepared for a big data loss incident. The reality is that lots of companies aren't where they should be in terms of their backup and restore capability, which will obviously impact their DevOps resilience. However, there is some really good news on the horizon. If we look at where we are now, 61% of teams have data backup, but 22% are planning to adopt this year. So that's great news for resilience in the platform. As of this time next year, 83% should have data backup in place, which is, I'm sure you'll agree, a much healthier proportion of teams protecting their orgs. We should say that this is true for both data and metadata. You need to be able to restore both, and they should both factor into your disaster recovery testing. Plus, when you factor in all those other DevOps processes that people plan to adopt, source control, monitoring, unit testing, more companies will be able to navigate a data loss incident and in that way vitally protect your business continuity. It's great that teams are actively pursuing or planning to adopt better DevOps processes, but there will always be challenges to overcome on that journey. There's always challenges. Anytime we bring in a new process or tool into our workflow, it's inevitable. So let's look at some of the key challenges faced by you and your teams. Deployments were the most frequently mentioned challenge. Teams still struggle to deploy complex metadata types and dependencies between orgs, especially if they're still using chain sets. At Gearset, we've focused on deployment success. That's the metric we drive ourselves by internally. So we look at all deployments that happen across our system globally, in aggregate, anonymized, obviously, and we look for hotspots of failure. We look for cases where particular metadata types, particularly new parts of the platform, where people struggle to deploy them. We then build that intelligence into Gearset through what we call problem analyzers to check your deployment package before it ever goes to Salesforce to make sure that it will succeed when it gets there. We monitor and we iterate and we get the deployment success rate up. We've got that over 90% now. So if you do a deployment with Gearset, 9 times out of 10, it's going to work. Team expansions was another common issue people mentioned. Working with lots of new team members and multiple work streams in parallel, it can be difficult, especially if you haven't got great processes in place. It's particularly difficult when you have admins and developers working together through divergent processes. So if you've got some folks working in chain sets and some folks in VS Code or SFDX CLI, you're inevitably going to run into friction. So bringing together a holistic DevOps process, that's really important. Keeping development and production environments in sync, another major challenge, as was adopting source control, adding new DevOps tooling, workflow integration, and adopting CI/CD automation. So how are teams solving these challenges? Well, the way that successful teams overcome these challenges is having a good understanding of what a DevOps process should look like for them. And then it's finding and utilizing the right tools for that process, whether it's working with multiple tools in your own DIY DevOps toolkit or using a complete solution like Gearset. That's how your team will be able to click together those DevOps puzzle pieces and beat those challenges. Gearset is one of those complete solutions that is helping teams implement DevOps. And I've got a few customer stories that I'd like to share with you. Traction on Demand is this amazing platinum consulting partner in North America, an absolutely incredible team. It's doubled its headcount every single year, delivering successful project after project. And one of the ways they've done that is by making sure that Gearset is in across all of their projects. So when they bring in a new team member, they can train them on Gearset. They have that consistency of delivery across all of their projects. And Gearset is helping them deploy with more quality than they would have otherwise. Gearset is handling all those complex metadata types and difficult dependencies and Salesforce quirks for them, so they can spend a lot less time deploying and a lot more time building value for their clients. Another challenging area is for newly expanded teams in hyper-growth companies. Intercom, the live chat and conversational intelligence platform for sales, support, and marketing teams, they've switched to using Gearset. And they now release 3 to 4 times each and every day. And it's a seamless process that doesn't discriminate between admin and developer roles. Everyone's included. Gearset also helps you keep environments in sync. Zillow, the leading real estate platform, they've gone from manually tracking changes to a complete source-driven process through Gearset. And having source-driven DevOps through Gearset enables their whole team to get bought in, which brought the average deployment time down from 8 hours to well under an hour, which gave them the added bonus of releasing multiple times per day. So that's what some of the bleeding edge teams are doing at the moment. But what does the future look like? And an interesting question to ask ourselves is, what are things going to look like a year from today? As teams and companies mature into DevOps, the Salesforce ecosystem as a whole is evolving. Here are just 5 trends that the survey results pointed towards. At this stage, less than 15% of respondents aren't planning to adopt DevOps this year, and inevitably they will fall behind. At some point, they're going to have to implement something, and the longer they wait, the more difficult it is going to be. Devs and admins alike will be using source control, and many admins already tell us that Git is their most valuable DevOps tool. It can seem complex to begin with, it can even seem intimidating, but if you get great tooling in place and do the courses through things like DevOps Launchpad, it's super easy. DevOps is going to make companies more agile and better enabled to meet business challenges faster. So it's really important as we exit this pandemic, we're going to need to be able to react as organizations, and DevOps is one of the pillars supporting that. As companies see that agility, as they see what else that brings them, the ROI will become self-evident. Teams are saving their time across the entire development cycle, and that's saving them thousands of dollars from manual deployments alone when moving to an automated process. Companies will be resilient thanks to DevOps adoption, and with all of the backup and rollback options for both data and metadata. Don't miss out on these trends. If you haven't begun adopting DevOps, that's okay, just don't get left behind now. DevOps has absolutely gone mainstream, and the time for moving ahead with DevOps is now. If you've started, keep going, keep maturing your process, keep improving your DevOps performance, because that's what DevOps is. It's about being self-critical, understanding where the bottlenecks are, and improving your velocity. And most importantly, help your company get the most out of Salesforce. A DevOps process, it shouldn't get in your way. Remember that the focus here is on building apps and getting them out to your users to make them successful on the platform. I hope you enjoy the rest of the amazing lineup at the Future of DevOps Summit. Be sure to follow us, follow Gearset on Twitter and LinkedIn, as that'll be the first place you can get the full report into the State of Salesforce DevOps. Thank you very much.